Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to day 2 of the Hindu Thought Conclave, The Huddle, presented by Yes Bank and powered by SRM University. Our first session for the day is Balancing Growth and Inflation. To discuss this, I invite the panelists, Dr. D. Subbarao, former Governor of Reserve Bank of India, Dr. C. Rangarajan, former Governor of Reserve Bank of India, and Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of India. I also invite Raghavan Srinivasan, editor, The Hindu Business Line, who will moderate the session.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the huddle. Today's session is on the subject of balancing growth and inflation. I think we have a panel which is possibly the best qualified to talk on the subject. Definitely in the Indian context, the speakers need no introduction. We have two former governors of the Reserve Bank of India and the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, who between them, I think, basically have been charting the course of economic development of the Indian economy, definitely through most of the post-reforms period. So what I would like to do basically is to sort of start by asking the panelists to set the context for the discussion by really examining the core question itself. Should it be, or is it always growth versus inflation? In other words, is it always necessary to have a trade-off? Can you have sustainable high growth and manage inflation at the same time, or that one necessarily means compromising on the other? We could go in any order you like, but since Dr. Rangarajan is sitting right next to me, perhaps I could start with him.
Is this
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, and a very good morning to all of you. The issue of the trade-off between inflation and growth has been discussed in the literature for many years. The dynamics of this trade-off between growth and inflation has its origin in the famous Phillips curve, which postulated a trade-off between originally the wage rate and the unemployment rate, later on between price and unemployment rate. Namely, that you can buy growth with a little more inflation. I think that was the implication. But then later, analysts clearly showed that the Phillips curve is not really valid under many conditions. It is not really, even in the Phillips curve context, a trade-off between inflation and growth, but unanticipated inflation and growth. And later on, once they said that inflationary expectations are also introduced into it, there is no trade-off between inflation and growth. Basically, we need to look at the problem from a long term and a short and medium term. Over the long term, there is no conflict between growth and inflation. In fact, sustained high growth rate over the long period is possible only in an environment of reasonable price stability. Perhaps in the short term, there is some trade-off between inflation and growth. But then that has to be managed in a way in which it does not undermine growth itself. I will later on cite some examples of situations in which, when we pursued growth, ignoring inflation, we ended up with a much bigger problem at the end of it. Therefore, sometimes people talk in terms, I have used the expression, threshold inflation. The level of inflation beyond which, when inflation exceeds, then it becomes an impediment to growth. The well-known Taylor formula, which was used in monetary policy, was that the policy rate should be increased when there is a divergence between the actual growth rate and the potential growth rate, and between actual inflation and potential acceptable level of inflation. That is, if the inflation in the community is running at a level higher than the acceptable level of inflation, then the monetary authorities should act. Now, the question that arises is, what is this acceptable level of inflation? There could be differences of opinion among people as to what it is. I recall that in the mid-1980s, when we were writing the report on the reform of the monetary system, both Chakravarti and I indicated that 4% inflation rate was perhaps an acceptable level. Please remember, in all of these discussions, we are not talking about zero inflation rate. I think that is going to be impossible, because when growth occurs, different segments grow in different phases, and therefore inflation to some extent is inevitable. Inflation in the sense the price increases. But we suggested 4% of the inflation rate, and more recently people are talking about 4% with plus or minus 2%. The point really is that ultimately what we are really looking at is growth with some degree of stability. We talk about price stability, but we need to give some concreteness to the concept of price stability. Price stability means what? It has to be at some level of inflation which is acceptable. Therefore, in my opinion, the movement towards a system in which the monetary authority, for example, is required to maintain inflation at around a level which is acceptable and beyond which it is quite clear that rising inflation will harm growth itself. My point is, which I have expressed many times, is the sustainability of growth itself is dependent on the level of inflation. Inflation beyond a particular point is not conducive to economic growth. So there are disputes about what this acceptable level of inflation is. But the point which I wish to make initially is basically that growth is important. I mean, growth is the answer to many of our, not only the economic problems, but also socio-economic problems. And therefore, growth, sustaining a high rate of growth in the economy is extremely important. But then we need to consider also that the growth has to be consistent with a certain degree of stability, without which that growth cannot be sustained for a long time. And therefore, what we really need to work towards is a level of inflation beyond which our authority is enjoined with the responsibility of controlling inflation must take action. You cannot have inflation running at 7-8%, let us say, and then say, oh, growth is important, and therefore I will let the inflation go. I don't think so. I think that is not the right approach. Have some concept of an acceptable level of inflation, and consistent with it, maintain the high rate of growth. But let me say once again, before I conclude my initial remarks, that sustained high growth over a long period also requires reasonable degree of price stability.
I think that's a very good segue into my question for you, Dr. Ahluwalia, which is that, yes, so a reasonable degree of stability on the inflation front is a necessary condition for maintaining high or sustained growth. But is it a sufficient condition?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I feel a bit sort of overwhelmed. It's always dangerous to sit between two governors. 'Cause so I'm going to bring a bit of a common man's touch. I agree with everything that Dr. Rangarajan has said. He really covered very extensive ground. But let me pose the issue just a little bit differently to make some points. I think the basic problem, I think, when we talk about growth, is that we're not focusing on sustainable growth of potential output. I mean, you can have growth given a particular level of, say, output capacity. You can pump up the capacity, the production beyond that capacity. Now, macroeconomic balance means that you want to achieve the same amount of demand in the system that will sustain the potential output of the system, given that there'll be some leakages through exports and imports. That's macroeconomic balance. Now, if you are in macroeconomic balance, then, and you've got the demand balance, and you want to push for more output, which will show up as higher growth, you can do that by operating on the demand side. And many people recommend, they keep saying, we need more demand, consumer demand, some fellows say investment demand, etc. But the problem is, if you're pushing up the output beyond the productive capacity of the economy, then that increase is going to lead to inflation and an increase in the current account deficit, which will lead to a depreciation of the exchange rate, which will feed back into the system in the form of inflation. So it's as Dr. Rangarajan said, it's a short-run way of pushing up growth, generates a lot of other problems, and probably not worth it. But on the other hand, if you're thinking of growth as the policies that will increase the productive capacity of the economy, that doesn't contradict the objective of inflation. I mean, for example, if you're focusing on increasing productivity, if you're focusing on getting rid of distortions which improve efficiency in the system, improving the access to key factors like land, getting rid of distortions in labor which prevent people from investing, all of those things are pro-growth, but they're not in any sense threatening inflation. On the contrary, I think they're actually helpful. So if you look at it this way, there is a situation, and this comes back to what Dr. Rangarajan described as the Taylor rule. I mean, obviously, if inflation is below what you think is an acceptable level, and output is also below potential, then there's a clear case of lowering interest rates because it's good for both. Equally, if output is above potential, so the economy is overheated, and inflation is also above your target level, then from a monetary point of view, there's a very strong compulsion to tighten monetary policy, raise interest rates. The challenge arises when output is actually above potential, output is below potential, so that would suggest you want to lower interest rate in order to stimulate output. But on the other hand, inflation is above acceptable levels, so you want to tighten it. And what the Taylor rule did was, it gave numbers which enabled you to say, okay, this is so much below output, so that means a little bit of a lowering of inflation, that's so much above the inflation target, that means so much tightening, and the net effect is... Now, by the way, Taylor never described this as a prescriptive rule. What he said is, this roughly describes what central banks do. Okay, so it was a description. So looked at that way, I would say that there are a wide range of policies which are pro-growth, which are actually the crucial policies for long-term growth, which in no sense go against inflation. There are circumstances in the short run where it's necessary to pump up output if you think output is below potential. But in the current debate, that's half the problem. A lot of this is forward-looking. I mean, central banks have to judge what is output going to be like and what is inflation going to be like. So you have a funny situation because on the one hand, the present Monetary Policy Committee probably worries that the fiscal deficit is a bit off track. And normally that would suggest that you don't lower inflation. They think that GDP growth is doing fine because, after all, the government says it's going to be between 7 and 7.5%. Now, if we're really growing at 7 and 7.5%, there's really no case for lowering interest. But the business community, which looks at it, when you talk to them privately, they say, well, who's growing at 7 and 7.5%? So this is not a debate on theory. This is a difference of fact. All I'm saying is it's very difficult to come to a conclusion on an actual position on policy without sorting all these things out. So it's complicated, which is, I think, why Alan Greenspan's famous remark, I think he was giving testimony to the House of Commons, no, to the Senate or something. And he gave a long speech. And at the end of it, he said to the senators that if you think you've understood what I've said, you probably haven't been listening closely enough. So, you know, anyway, that's my first thing.
So very much true in my case. Dr. Subbarao, let me ask you. I think, this really this was the, I think, the core dilemma that you yourself tackled throughout your tenure as the governor of the Reserve Bank. In fact, even the title of your book is "Who Moved My Interest Rate?" So the question really, and I think they've been, the context has been set by the first two speakers, but we still have a definitional problem. What is an acceptable rate to, say, a central bank or a policymaker may not be an acceptable rate for other participants in the economy. So what is an acceptable rate for inflation, which you can have a general consensus on? How do you come to that? The second is basically expectations from policy actions when the conditions on the ground differ from whatever is the perceived normal. Okay, so how do you deal with that dilemma?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone from my side. It's difficult to be original after two eminent economists have spoken on a subject that's very relevant to India. But I first want to start with this growth versus inflation trade-off. Many people, including trained economists, believe that there's a trade-off between growth and inflation. Like Dr. Rangarajan said, they believe that if you want low and steady inflation, you have to sacrifice growth. On the other hand, if you want rapid growth, you've got to tolerate higher inflation. I think that's an interesting dichotomy, but a false one. There is no trade-off between growth and inflation at any rate in the long term. In the short term, perhaps, you can buy higher growth by tolerating higher inflation, but in the long term, low and steady inflation is a necessary condition for growth. You asked another question, whether it was a sufficient condition. I don't believe it's a sufficient condition. It is necessary. But in order to generate growth, you need to do a lot of other things. So, like Mr. Ahluwalia referred to them, all the things that the government has to do, all that the central bank, all that the Reserve Bank can do, or for that matter, any central bank can do, is to maintain price stability and raise growth to the potential level. But if you want, raising the potential growth level itself cannot be the remit of the central bank. It's got to be done by the government. So both the government and the central bank, in our case the Reserve Bank of India, have to be working towards attaining a macroeconomic situation of low and steady inflation and growth consistent with that. Many people try to compartmentalize this, like governments of growth and central banks offer inflation. Mr. Chidambaram famously said, that he wrote in his column as well, that governments always want growth and central banks always want inflation, in effect implying very clearly that there is a trade-off. I don't believe that's the case. Both government policies have impact on output and inflation. The central bank policies have impact on output and inflation. Now, what about, your third question, what's an acceptable level of inflation? Dr. Rangarajan said that 4% has been determined on the basis of certain estimation, keeping in view India's conditions. Yeah, I think that is, of course, true. I mean, you don't contest what Dr. Rangarajan has said. So that's certainly true. But where does this 4% come from? This relationship between growth and inflation is non-linear. At a certain level, maybe when inflation is below that threshold level, maybe you can generate higher growth by raising inflation. But beyond a certain point, as I said earlier, if inflation goes up, growth goes down. So that inflection point, where the trade-off comes into play, is the threshold inflation. In India, that happens to be 4% inflation. A lot of people ask, why can't we have 2% inflation? Why can't we have zero inflation? Of course, zero inflation is a no-no. And I don't want to go into that because everybody knows that you cannot have zero inflation. You need low and steady inflation. In our case, it's 4%. In rich countries, it is 2%. Why can't we have 2%? We can't have 2% because we are a large consumption economy. There is 50 or whatever percentage of people live below $2 per day. Enormous poverty levels. Any increase in income quickly translates to consumption and therefore to demand pressure and therefore to inflation. So we are susceptible to inflation. Therefore, I think we cannot have 2% inflation. 4% inflation is a tolerable level of inflation. I think I've answered all your questions about acceptable level of inflation.
Yes. But, reality has this tendency to confound theories. Dr. Ahluwalia, during your stint, I think the Indian economy arguably saw the longest sustained period of high growth in recent times, and definitely since we started measuring and tracking growth of the economy. We also, during this period, saw very high fluctuations in inflation, extreme spikes in inflation, and we had different policy responses which were tried out during that period to tackle this question. In hindsight, what do you think works best?
Well, clearly on the supply side, I mean, now that we've all agreed about the importance of potential output, I think during that entire period, lots of things were being done to increase potential output. I mean, the biggest thing was a huge increase in investment. I mean, during the 2000s, the GDP, fixed capital formation as a percent of GDP shot up, okay? That was something that was, as it were, creating the potential for higher growth. Probably that was also the period, by the way, when we didn't have low inflation, but not because of domestic mismanagement. And during that period, the fiscal deficit for most of it was coming down, but you had a very high international price increase, which made it difficult to control domestic inflation. Now, in terms of reality, let me tell you, politicians have a much more difficult job than we think. Because, they're not just interested in low inflation. They're interested in low inflation in every commodity. So if you're a finance minister, you're terrified at a news item which says that the price of tomatoes has shot up, or the price of some onion has shot up, even if other agricultural prices are collapsing. So people very rarely look at the fact that, look, yes, the price of onions or tomatoes or whatever it is rose, but during that period, inflation was only about 3.5%. And if you listen to the farmers, they're saying agricultural prices have collapsed. So the poor fellows are really under attack on every front. Let me just add one other point. If you want to question all of us who are saying there's no trade-off, and kind of that's what we're saying, but economics would not be an interesting subject if it didn't lend itself to multiple interpretations on virtually everything. Okay? That's why it's now being discredited. But I just want to give you one example. When is it that inflation forms a positive element in creating high growth? it does it in an environment where relative price changes can only take place through an inflationary environment. Okay? High growth involves structural change, and structural change involves change in relative prices. Now, if prices were equally flexible upward and downward, it would be possible to achieve the relative price change that you need with an overall level of price stability. Okay? But the truth is, prices are not equally flexible. They tend to be rigid downwards. And that's what a lot of people say is that, if you're going to bring about a relative price change, it's a lot easier to do it by tolerating a higher level of inflation, because it achieves the relative price change, which is supposed to be good for other things like growth, etc., etc. And people vary. Dr. Rangarajan rightly said that the monetary side of the Indian establishment has always zeroed in on 4%, ever since his report with Shukmoy and all. 4% is a good rate. Now they've introduced this band, okay? But even in the days when RBI would say 5%, 4%, opinion within government would vary. I remember RBI would say 4%, Finance Ministry would say, 5% is reasonably okay, and the Planning Commission would say, 6% is actually okay, because the Planning Commission was very keen to push more investment, which would actually create a little bit of a demand imbalance. But a visiting economist, Joe Stiglitz, was very distinguished, Nobel laureate and all the rest of it. He was once asked that, isn't it a problem when inflation goes up that you create distortions? And he said, I've done some analysis, and there's no distortion as long as inflation is below 15%. Which would be an absurd number for India. So, opinions on these things vary enormously. But please have a little bit of sympathy for whoever is the finance minister, because he cannot go before any audience and say, I know the price of tomatoes have gone up 40%, but the CPI has only increased by 3%, and you fellows should be quite happy. He is lambasted in Parliament and all the rest of it.
Rangarajan, you wish to...
Well, it's interesting to note that policy making or policy administration becomes interesting because we cannot find direct answers to some of the problems. I think that's the dilemma that was posed by Montek looking at the Taylor's rule was what happens when the actual output is below potential output and inflation is above the acceptable level. That is the situation which is most difficult. Somebody said about central banking that central banking is neither a science nor an art, but a craft. Well, this is also not a very correct statement, because central banking is no longer applying well-known techniques to well-known problems. Neither the techniques nor the problems are very clear. But the question really is that from an understanding of the economy, from an understanding of the working of the economy, one has to come to some conclusion, however tentative it may be, regarding when the inflation goes beyond a particular level, it hurts the economy. Stiglitz as a way of saying many things. This is not the only observation that he had made with which we can take objection to. Therefore, Subbarao asked me about the 4%, where from this 4% came. It is possible. Looking at the data, I have done an estimation as well on this, looking at the past data, assuming that the structure of the economy remains more or less the same, there is always possible to find out at what level of inflation does this really become an issue and growth does get affected. The 4, 5, 6 are the numbers that are being talked about. I believe that 4% plus or minus 2% is a good compromise in the sense that there is a comfort zone. It is not as if that you are riveted only on 4%. But my contention is that inflation targeting or any approach similar to it does not mean that the other objectives are not adhered to. So long as you are within the comfort zone, other objectives become also relevant. But once the economy goes beyond the comfort zone, I believe, at least the monetary authorities are concerned, the dominant objective should be to control inflation. Yeah. I think that is a way to resolve the problem, but that still leaves the question, what is that acceptable level of inflation on which there can be a difference of opinion? One short point to make, that we should also remember that the acceptable level of inflation that we have in mind may be out of line with the level of inflation which many other countries may think is appropriate, in which case your exchange rate also becomes an issue, and the exchange rate of depreciation becomes relevant if your inflation if there is a difference in the inflation rates.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Subbarao.
Yeah, this question of growth versus economics is a standard textbook question. It's also a practical question across every country, in rich countries, in poor countries, in emerging economies like India. But I think the question is different. The answers are different. In the US or in Europe or in Japan, they talk about growth versus inflation. I think that's a different question from growth versus inflation in an emerging economy like India. Because inflation in a country like India emerges not just from demand pressures, it also comes more usually not from supply side pressures. If oil prices go up, we have inflation. If food prices go up, we have inflation. Central banks, even the Reserve Bank, typically overlooks inflation arising from supply side constraints if it is transient. For example, if food prices go up because there's a transporter strike and food distribution gets held up, there's inflation. We know that that is temporary inflation. We look through that. We don't respond to it. But on the other hand, if the supply pressure, if the supply shock is consistent, is sustained, the central bank has to respond. And in India, supply shocks are sustained. We are a high energy importer. Oil prices, not only if they're rising, but if they're high, even if they're not rising, if they're high, that causes inflation. Food causes inflation. This is an economy with a per capita income of $1,800. So any increase in income quickly translates to consumption. And people buy more motorcycles, more cell phones. They also diversify. They eat better quality food. They shift from carbohydrates to protein. So inflation goes up. So when food inflation is persistent, when inflation arising from energy shocks is persistent, the growth versus inflation debate in India is quite different from the growth versus inflation debate in advanced economies.
No, but the issue also then becomes what is the route that we adopt? To me, going by what all of you have said so far, the issue still is somewhat open, but the fact remains that we have actually voted for a particular approach. We have the Monetary Policy Committee has been created, the RBI has been mandated with inflation targeting as its primary policy goal, and I think that's where a lot of the current unhappiness with the policy directions coming from the Reserve Bank or the government with the other players in the economy comes from that, because we used words like acceptable level of inflation fairly often during the course of the discussion.
I thought you used that phrase first.
Yes. There is also the question of what is an acceptable level of growth. What is the level of growth where growth feels like growth is happening? Currently the issue, for instance, is that we seem to have a fairly decent growth rate in terms of GDP growth. But there is, I think, not a commensurate visible impact in terms of the consumption side or on the job creation front. So the question is that, have we as a country perhaps moved towards inflation targeting a little too early in our growth cycle?
Good, you're zeroing in, putting us on the defensive. First, let me, I quite like acting as a devil's advocate, but I want to clarify one or two things. One, I agree with both Dr. Rangarajan and Dr. Subbarao that 4 plus minus 2 is an advance. I don't believe there's anyone who's challenging it. The reason I mentioned Stiglitz was just to emphasize that, economists can differ. I agree, 4 plus minus 2. What is missing in the current debate, in my view, is an excessive focus on the monetary instrument as the key driver of growth and jobs and all the rest of it. As I said earlier, the key thing is what is determining the potential growth of the economy. And that's not something that's the job of the Reserve Bank to do. The interesting thing is that we are very upset because the Reserve Bank is following a rule, but we don't seem to mind at all that the fiscal deficit is happily departing from the rule. So, if you want to run a rule-bound economy, you can have the following sort of situations. The monetary system is following the rule. The fiscal system is also following the rule, but something's wrong. Then I think we really need to think. If you had to ask one question, which part of the economy is not following the rule that was established some time ago, it's clearly the fiscal deficit. I'm not making the point just about the present government, it's also true in the previous. We kept postponing the date by which this fiscal deficit and revenue deficit target was going to be met. This government has also done it again. And I can understand, for example, that in the current year, which is about to end, maybe the fiscal deficit exceeded a little bit because, after all, there were lots of tax changes and there's this 11-month problem with GST and so on. But it's very difficult to understand why it should depart from the rule next year if GDP is going to grow at 7 and 7.5% and the tax system is stabilizing. So, the destabilizing influences are not just what's on the monetary side, it's also on the fiscal side. I want to pick up something that Dr. Rangarajan touched upon, which is the exchange rate. Now, one of the things that has been done in the current budget, which I think the finance minister himself identified as a reversal of a long trend of policy, was the moderation of customs duties. Okay? I think in 40 or 50 items, customs duties have been raised. Okay? Now, it's also true, and I think the Economic Survey and others have pointed out, that the real effective exchange rate, that is adjusting for the price differential, has appreciated about 20% since 2014. Now, isn't this a case where the appreciation of the real effective exchange rate is generating demand on the part of domestic producers for more protection, which would be better achieved by having a more realistic exchange rate rather than jacking up import duties? And we've seen that movie before, and it can be an endless stream of these things, and it's a complete, I think, a very regrettable step that's been taken. So actually, when you look at economic policy, it's very narrowing to reduce everything to one particular rule or the Monetary Policy Committee or even just the fiscal. I think you really need a macroeconomic toolkit. And things can get wrong in different parts of the toolkit, which is why, in my view, a good economic policy is one where the central bank and the finance ministry are constantly in discussion on which of the two sets of rules suggest the biggest need for correction. And I suppose the rest of the government, now the Niti Aayog, come in on these other things also. You can't narrow down macroeconomic policy into a very, very limited discussion of what's happening on macro, but definitely on monetary policy. But I do agree that the general proposition that a moderate inflation is an important thing. Anybody saying, doesn't matter if inflation is 6%, let's go for growth, they just don't know what they're talking about. And what is worse, this is the other thing, I think Dr. Rangarajan made this point, that, on any longer term horizon, it'll kill growth. Because if the expectation of high inflation sets into the system, it will be very painful and a long process before you can get rid of it. And I think from that point of view, we may be violating a rule here and there, but the broad perception that we have a monetary policy rule and we have some sort of restriction on the central government deficit is a good thing. Of course, the big weakness is we have no restriction at all on state government deficits, which, if you ask me, is the real weak point in the current situation. And each of these can destabilize the macro.
Well, two points I would like to make. One was the point that you raised about the questions that are being raised about the stance that monetary policy is taking in recent times after the introduction of the new monetary policy framework. I want to tell you that if you look at the past and look at the developments, these questions have been raised all the time. I mean, this is not the first time the people are raising the question that why did you not lower the rate of interest? During my period also, and perhaps during Subbarao's period also, these questions have been raised. And when the Reserve Bank of India follows a particular policy, then they are saying that why can't you lower the rate of interest? So these questions will keep coming. I think this cannot be resolved easily because the perceptions differ. Even when you are within the comfort zone, whether inflation is likely to rise or whether inflation is likely to go down or whether the growth rate is going to pick up or not. So long as there are differences of opinion on what the future trends about growth rate and inflation, these questions will continue to be raised, and this is irrespective of the monetary policy framework that we have adopted. Because the monetary policy framework has only said that you try to maintain the inflation rate between these limits. And my interpretation of inflation targeting is that the major concern or the dominant concern or the only concern of the monetary authority when the inflation exceeds the comfort zone is to focus on inflation. I think at that particular point, let us not talk about the alternatives that are possible. Second, and I would like to briefly comment on what Montek said about the monetary rule, the fiscal rule. In fact, there are some people who seem to say that why are you following these rules for monetary policy and fiscal policy? And in economic literature, there is a long discussion on what used to be called, or what is being called, rules versus discretion. Some people argue that what is really required is discretion, and we don't need any rules. And if the authorities have the proper mind, they will do the right thing, and therefore rules are not needed. And when we talk of rules, rules can be rigid or rules can be flexible. We had the rules under the gold standard system, which says expand credit when gold comes in and contract credit when gold goes out. The rule was so rigid, neither was it followed, and it was also broken. Therefore, the rules have to be flexible. Therefore, one should not talk about rules versus discretion, rules plus some discretion. And that is what is being done right now, even with respect to monetary policy. I entirely agree that as far as the fiscal rule is concerned, it has been more honored in breach than in observance. There was only 1 year in the whole period since the FRBM Act was passed when the fiscal deficit was below 3% or was at 3%. We need to have some rules. You can exercise discretion, and that discretion has been exercised too much. We have changed the roadmap for fiscal consolidation almost every year in the last several years. Therefore, I believe economic policy needs to be guided by certain rules, and some discretion is also to be given in terms of the implementation of the rules.
So my final question to all of you is that if you were to apply this discretion to the situation which applies right now, to the Indian economy as it stands today, with the challenges that we are facing, the challenge of reviving, domestic investment, the challenge of reviving demand, the challenge of, boosting job creation, and of course the longer running challenges of the economy itself, the huge infrastructure deficit that we are facing, the need for government to actually lead the way in that. What is it that should be actually done? Right. So we talked about a lot of, the theoretical ifs and buts, but, given the situation that exists now, what do you think should be the approach? What needs to be done to sort of maybe just push us on to the next, level of growth?
Before I answer that question, I just want to address the earlier question about inflation targeting.
Right.
Your direct question was whether we've accepted an inflation targeting framework prematurely, whether the economy was prepared for it. I want to respond to that question in particular because as governor, I had expressed reservations about inflation targeting framework. And then subsequently during Governor Rajan's time, we'd accepted it. And it's worked reasonably well so far. So what was the reason for my reservations? And will it work very well from here on? Very pertinent questions. I had reservations first because around the world there was inflation targeting. We had the great moderation in the years before the crisis, advanced economies having steady growth, low inflation, emerging economies having rapid growth, low and steady inflation. Everybody was happy. But then we had the crisis. In part, the crisis happened for many reasons. But one of the important reasons was central banks were committed to inflation targeting, somewhat strict inflation targeting. So by the time I became governor, inflation targeting had lost credibility. The view around the world, both in governments, in central banks, among economists, in the academia, in the markets, the view was that strict inflation targeting is a no-no. So from there, we moved to a flexible inflation targeting, which is that the central bank tries to maintain price stability, but keeping an eye on growth. That's exactly what happened. Now the Reserve Bank does monetary policy within an inflation targeting framework. Earlier, we used to do monetary policy without an inflation targeting framework. I don't believe there's much difference between what we used to do before and what we do now, except that now there is contestability. There is accountability for what the central bank does. And I think to that extent, it is good. But I also want to say that the inflation targeting framework has not been tested so far. The test will come when growth is low and declining, and inflation is high and going up, when we have a near stagnation situation, which we feared in 2012. Both Dr. Rangarajan and Mr. Ahluwalia were in the government. I was in the Reserve Bank. There were a lot of questions in 2012 whether we were heading for stagnation. That's when the real question between growth versus inflation, tension between growth and inflation, and what should monetary policy do, whether we should adhere to an inflation targeting framework, those questions will come at that point of time. So I think the inflation targeting framework has been reasonably good so far, but it's not been tested. Test will also come when there's capital flows, when there's pressure on the exchange rate. What does the Reserve Bank do? Will it remain committed to inflation, or will it try to manage the exchange rate, giving it higher priority over inflation management? These are questions, as both Dr. Rangarajan and Mr. Ahluwalia said, these are questions that cannot be laid down by rules. You need to play on the ball, as it were, depending on the situation. Now, to your last question about what needs to be done, as everyone has agreed, the central bank can manage policies only to raise growth rate to the potential growth rate. It cannot by itself raise the potential growth rate. Potential growth rate has to be raised by policies of the government. And of course, we need to get investment. The most important thing, if you ask me in one word, what do we need to do? We need to get investment. Investment went up to 38% of GDP, is below 30% now. So we need to raise investment, and we need to do a whole lot of things to raise investment. That will be another panel discussion about what we need to do, and we're running out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I agree with Dr. Subbarao that there should be another panel discussion on this issue. I also agree that the principal focus should really be on investment. In my view, I don't think that the raising of investment would be an automatic response to a lowering of the interest rate. I think there are many other things that are more important. And quite frankly, in my view, making sure that the banking system functions and gets out of the mess that it's been in the last 3 or 4 years should have very high priority, along with all these other things to increase potential. Subbarao mentioned what happened in the great financial crisis. One view of that period is that everybody was fooled by the low inflation, and central bankers became the masters of the universe, whereas in fact, asset prices were going through the roof. So had the inflation index at that time included asset prices, particularly in the US home prices that were totally unreasonable, they would not have said that they've stabilized. The other side of the same coin is if they had looked at what was happening to the financial stability of the system. It was actually being ruined. And as a matter of fact, Rangarajan said that at Alan Greenspan's 65th birthday, and he got bashed up for it in this conference of bankers. Yes. So we are at the moment, to my mind, we need to be focusing on making sure, A, that the banks must be stable, which means good, strong regulation, and subject to that they actually get back to lending. And I mean, we have to address what is it that is actually holding back that lending, because that expansion in lending is not taking place, and every time we have a scam, you can be sure that that gets postponed by another 5 months. Yes. So for purely short-term response, I would really focus on fixing the banks, which is not a monetary policy issue, it's a banking system financial stability issue. Clearly the RBI and the government have a big role, because 70% of the banks are still public sector banks.
Sure. Yes. Dr. Rangarajan, you have...
One comment that I want to make on inflation targeting. The emergence of the 2008 crisis is not, in my opinion, a failure of inflation targeting. What the inflation targeters forgot was inflation target, in my interpretation, as I mentioned, was not that when you are in the comfort zone, you should not use monetary policy for some other objective. I think that is the mistake that they made. When stock prices were rising, going through the sky, and asset prices were rising, they were required to take action on that. I mean, the central banker should really look at it. In fact, you remember that in the good old days, the selective credit controls came into operation only because of the operations in the stock market, fixing the flow of credit to the stock market. Therefore, the failure was in the central banks not acting and reacting to the situation when asset prices were rising. Finally, to the point that Srinivasan raised about what can be done about the current economic situation. It is obvious that we are all operating, or the economy is operating below the potential. If one uses the word potential as the maximum extent to which an economy can grow, it is certainly about 8 to 9%, but because we have shown for a 5-year period, the economy can grow between 8 and 9%, and therefore that is where it should be. And however good the number like 6.7 or 7 looks, it is below the potential, and therefore we need to raise it. Now, the question to answer is, what can the various tools do? What can monetary policy do, for example? Monetary policy, in my opinion, is not in a position to do very much here. Monetary policy per se, not banking policy. I will make one comment on that. Monetary policy by itself will not be able to do it because it is not really an interest rate problem. Even if you lower the interest rate, I am not very sure that the banks placed as they are will be in a position to lower the rate of interest on the loans. I think they have other problems. NPAs have been high, and therefore they would not be able to do it. Yes. So I think monetary policy at this particular point is not in a position to be able to stimulate growth. There is an old saying in central banking which says the central banking system is equipped with the efficient brakes, but the accelerator is uncertain. Yeah. So this accelerator is uncertain. Yes. Second, as far as fiscal policy is concerned, probably there is some role for capital expenditures by the public sector. But we must understand once again that the capital expenditures by central government, if you look at the budget, is less than 1.8% of the GDP. Therefore, you may increase it by a little, few percentage points, for decimal points, but it cannot do very much. Therefore, finally comes the private investment and private sector investment. You all know that the investment rate has fallen from something like 33 to 34% of the GDP to something like 27% of the GDP. Therefore, we know what has caused the decline in the growth rate, and that is a decline in investment rate. What can be done to stimulate private investment? One thing, of course, I agree with Montek, that the banking system needs to be put in a place so that it can make available the resources. But that is only from the side of making available the resources. But investment is an act of faith in the future. And therefore, people must expect that the rate of growth will rise in the future, and therefore the investment sentiment will increase. I do believe that what the government really should be doing is to get people from the industry of different sectors to come and meet them and really find out what are the bottlenecks that are really coming in the way of private investment. Some macro policy measures are useful, but a more focused attention on individual segments of the industry would be a good thing to do in the context.
Yes. So I think that sort of sums it up very well. At this stage, I'd like to throw the discussion open to the audience. If any of you have questions, please identify yourself and direct it towards. Can you get a mic there, please, at the back? Yes. Yes.
Oh. Is it on? Good morning, sirs. You have actually guided the Indian economy for more than 2 decades, all three of you combined. Have you ever, while computing, making your plans, ever thought of the environmental cost which the country is facing due to devastation of forest, exploitation of minerals, rains, vehicle precipitation getting reduced, loss of employment, which is actually quite high, and it is never computed by the financiers and economic policies like you, which is causing a lot of degradation of the country. Your comments, please.
Yeah. Would you like to take? Who is it addressed to? Do you have the question directed at somebody in specific?
Yes, sir, Mr. Montek.
Okay. Well, thanks. I'm glad you asked this. The question you asked was, did you ever think about it? Okay. I mean, you described me as guiding the economic policies for 10 years. That's actually a huge exaggeration. But I did have the honor of being involved in the government for 10 years and produced both the 11th plan and the 12th plan. Now, realizations always come a little late. But one of the interesting things is that in the 11th plan, which was done around 2007, 2008, and we were working on it a couple of years earlier, the big focus was, yes, we can get growth, but is it helping the poor? So there was a lot of emphasis in the 11th plan on inclusiveness, and the title of the 11th plan was called Towards Faster and More Inclusive Growth. And I'm happy to say that during that period, by any standards, the degree of inclusiveness of growth actually did improve hugely. I mean, in that period, agricultural growth was very rapid, compared to the past or compared to the recent past. Real wages increased, etc., etc. But we did begin to realize that environment was missing in order to ensure real sustainability. I mean, there's macro sustainability, which we were taking care of, but environmental sustainability, we became conscious of that in the 12th plan. And the 12th plan was called Towards Faster, More Inclusive and Sustainable Growth. Now, you know, slogans don't achieve results, but slogans date when governments are becoming aware of something. And I wrote something at that time which said that, look, if you look at our growth performance, our growth rate is higher than what most people thought it would be. Not as good as China, but higher than what most people thought it would be. That on inclusiveness, we've certainly done better than in the past, but maybe not as well as we ourselves had hoped. And on environment, the situation has actually deteriorated, in the sense that whatever indicator you look at, whether it's air pollution or water pollution, etc., 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 things were getting worse. Did we make recommendations that would take care of that problem? I would say yes, but neither were they accepted, nor were they picked up by the public. Let me just give you two critical recommendations, which in my view are extremely important for the environment, but received very little public support, and which we argued for very strongly. One of them was, as soon as possible, we should align our energy prices with global prices. Keeping energy prices low is a bad idea, and we should actually introduce a tax that would raise Indian coal prices to global levels. Of course, it's very difficult for governments to do these things, but I don't believe we got any support from the thinking community either. The second very important recommendation was on use of water. I mean, for example, in many of our states, a lot of the water use in agriculture is the use of groundwater. And the use of groundwater is humongously subsidized by making electricity free. Now, we have been arguing for a long time that both canal water rates should be raised to reflect some of the cost of irrigation, at least the operational cost of irrigation, and correspondingly, farmers should be given support in other ways, but not through cheap electricity. No willingness to accept this on the part of anybody, either at the central level or the state level. So I would not say that we didn't raise those issues, and by the way, those are still the relevant issues. I mean, today, states are happily offering free tariffs to farmers at a point where groundwater levels are dropping very sharply, causing a huge amount of pollution in the groundwater, because we're now bringing up groundwater that is adversely affected by all kinds of salts, etc. So I agree with what you're saying. It's very, very important, and I just hope that we don't have plans anymore, but the Niti Aayog must be working on longer-term policy. I hope that this gets focused and put in big time. And at that time, by the way, air pollution was not even publicly talked about. Today, I mean, I don't know, 18 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world are in India. And, you know, the only dimension in which we have beaten China is in the pollution in Delhi is now worse than Beijing. You know, in Beijing, pollution was humongous before the Olympic Games, and lots of adverse international publicity led the Chinese government to say, well, look, this is unacceptable, we must do something. And to their credit, they did. Now, the same thing is happening in India. And I regret to say it's not just Delhi, it's also Bangalore. So it's a real test of our city governments and state governments that are they going to do something about it? Now, the assumption that we're going to attract $60 billion of foreign investment and have 20 of the most polluted cities in the world in India, I mean, there's a fundamental contradiction here. Even if Dr. Subbarao's successors do a wonderful job of monetary policy, and the finance ministry does a wonderful job of fiscal policy, if we don't fix this, long-term potential growth will not be good. Yeah. And I'm glad you raised it as the first question from the audience, Because, in the past, the first question from the audience always used to be on inflation or growth or something like that. Yes. So obviously something is changing.
President Nasheed? Yes. Former President of Maldives.
Thank you. This is all very good news. So if there is no relationship between inflation and growth, as a politician, prizes is everything. So we will go for votes, and therefore we will only focus on keeping inflation down, if I have understood what you've been saying. I also want to ask the question, now production capacity, again, seems to be what is related to inflation. So I have been always talking about and thinking about a low carbon development strategy, and I think the previous question was that. Your planning and your rules, perhaps how much is it relevant or related to a low carbon development strategy which is less extraction and more recycling? So I think what I'm trying to get at is inflation, and I have been told that that is dependent on production capacity. And therefore, I am again more convinced now that this must depend on a low carbon development strategy.
Would you like to take it?
Well, just very briefly, since you responded to something I said, before we left, we had produced a report on a low carbon strategy for India. The present government has picked up many of those ideas, and certainly the focus, for example, on solar electricity in India right now is an acknowledgement of the fact that we cannot remain completely coal dependent. Now, how much progress we make on solar electricity, we will see, but the targets that have been set are very ambitious. So, governments generally are pushed to achieve those targets. So if those targets are achieved, the interesting thing is there will be many consequences. Because in order to absorb that much solar electricity into the grid, you have to do a lot of other things about how to manage the grid and bring about stability and so forth. So hopefully over time, there will be an acknowledgement that these things need to be done, plus the emphasis on electric vehicles. A lot of the pollution is caused by internal combustion engine being used in the cities. Now, I think the government has recognized that they can't change instantly, but quite clearly moving towards EVs is a global objective, and India seems to have endorsed that also. Now, this is where the industry is what Dr. Rangarajan was saying. You need an intense discussion with the industry. What is feasible? How fast can it be done? What supportive mechanisms are needed in order to bring it about? And if all that is done, we would actually have peaked. We can actually peak our use of coal by 2035 or something like that. Now, those things will all contribute to a solution to the global warming phenomenon. A small bit, but they will contribute.
Dr. Subbarao, you wanted to add something to this, yes?
Yeah, all I wanted to add was this, that I'm struck by the fact that our panel discussion on growth versus inflation has segued into growth versus environment.
Yes.
Just as there is no easy answer to this question about growth versus inflation, there is no easy answer to growth versus environment. In a panel discussion in a five-star hotel like this in Bangalore, where we stand on this growth environment trade-off, as it were, might be different from where the vast majority of the people in this country living in the hinterland, in the villages, where they trade off. If you tell tribal population in the country, don't cut forest, because cutting forest hurts environment, they're going to say, how stupid, what a stupid thing that is. Okay? Because they need to cut forest for their livelihood. So to say that we can determine this growth environment trade-off in a panel discussion or in a drawing board or a Niti Aayog, cutting off from the realities of the poverty of this country is very, very unrealistic. So we've got to do something to raise income levels, to get people out of poverty. Only then can we do something about environment. I know that people say that, they're not contradictory, they're not in conflict. You can have sustained growth while also looking after environment, but I think the equation or the trade-off for different people is different, and for the vast majority of the people in our country, it's different.
I think in the case of Maldives, since you're already a middle-income country, you can, I think, afford to adopt a more pro-planet approach to growth and development, perhaps.
I am still with the view that you can have the same economic outcomes, high growth, low inflation, through a low carbon construction.
Okay.
Would you like to respond?
Being a political leader, I can't contest what you're saying.
No, sir.
We have actually overshot our time by already about 15 minutes.
Sir, if you would permit me one last question, please. I've been
All
standing
right.
for a little while.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. There is an anti-profiteering clause in the present GST Act. Now, given that the repo rates from the RBI have been coming down over the last several years, actually, and the banks have not been passing on these rates commensurately, is there a strong case that banks be asked to disgorge the extra profits that are amounting to tens of thousands of crores that they have made at the expense of borrowers of the banking system, and return those profits that they have made back to the borrowing community? Is there a strong case for that? Because there is a profiteering clause in the GST Act.
No, I think you are extending the frontiers of the anti-profiteering provision. I mentioned earlier that the Reserve Bank of India might have lowered the policy rate, but the compulsions of the banks regarding what they should do are different, and therefore they have not been in a position to lower the rate. And also, I have also this view that whenever the Monetary Policy Committee or the Reserve Bank announces that the policy rate is lowered, we also need to know what actions that the monetary authority is taking in order to let the rate come down. I mean, there is no mention. In the good old days, we mentioned about money supply and so on. Now we talk about liquidity. Has the liquidity been increased in order to enable the rate of interest to come down? They cannot order interest rates. They cannot act like King Canutes. I mean, they really have to take action such that the rate can fall. And therefore, I would say that that's on the part of the Reserve Bank. But I think the compulsions of the banking system are different, and that is why you did not see a decline in the lending rate.
I think on that note, we have to bring this. I'm afraid we have overshot quite considerably. Yes.
The tribals never cut forest and cause devastation. It's the contractors and commercial contractors who cause devastation of forest. Tribals and the social forestry have all the rights to cut the forest.
All right. I think let's leave it at that. Thank you very much for a most stimulating and engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. D. Subbarao, Dr. C. Rangarajan, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and Raghavan Srinivasan. I request Raghavan Srinivasan to present mementos to our guests as a token of our appreciation. The memento is a print of the first editorial of The Hindu.